Hello and welcome to this new episode of Social Europe Talk about inflation and the cost of living crisis. My name is Stefan Thalhofer. I'm the Policy Officer for Economic and Social Affairs at the EU Office of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. This series of talks is a joint initiative of Social Europe Publishing and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, as you might have guessed already. And I'm sharing this pleasure today again with Robin Wilson, Editor-in-Chief of Social Europe. He will be chairing this session and also introduce our fantastic panel today for this subject. Before we start, let me just briefly introduce on behalf of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and mention that this talk today about inflation is part or is anchored in the context of a big two-year project at Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is entitled Progressive Fiscal Policy for a Just Future. This title might sound a bit abstract, but internally we have a working title, which is maybe a bit more telling, and it is a simple question, and the question is, who pays the bill? And I think this question is absolutely relevant in the context of our inflation and cost of living crisis debate, of course. And in the project, we work on two strands. The first strand is the public expenditure side, with important questions related, of course, to the massive needs for investment in the digital and green transitions. And then the second strand, of course, is then the revenue side, with the question of how to pay for it and subjects linked to just taxation and public deficit and debt. So I think all this comes along well with the subject of today, of course, and I hope that we will be finding some answers in this discussion to the question of who pays the bill, or maybe more adequately, who should be paying the bill in a just and fair manner in order to find solutions to the cost of living crisis. So finally, just let me thank our speakers of today on an excellent panel with various backgrounds from the trade unions, from think tanks and academia. Thank you for being with us, for sharing your ideas. Thank you also to our viewers or who watch the live stream or who rewatch later. And thank you also to you, Robin, for chairing this. And over to you now for a more comprehensive introduction of our speakers. Thank you. And I will close my camera so that you can enjoy full screen our speakers.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and hello, everybody. My name is Robin Wilson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Social Europe, and it's a pleasure to be introducing this panel today to discuss inflation and the cost of living crisis. We did envisage having an MEP, Paul Tang, to be part of the panel, and unfortunately Paul wasn't able to join us, but that does mean that we have probably the first ever all-women panel to discuss the cost of living crisis in Europe, and that may have its own advantages. That panel consists of, in alphabetical order, Lena Carr, the Confederal General Secretary, or a Confederal General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation, Georgia Kapanolou, Professor of Public Finance at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, and Philippa Siegel-Glügner, Director of Die Zernat Zukunft. I'm very grateful to all of you for giving of your time to take part today. And I'll begin with this question, which is really focused on what the causes of the inflation that we are seeing today might be. No one doubts the severity of the cost of living crisis affecting Europeans, and indeed even more so the rest of the world's population, especially the most vulnerable. But there is a dispute about the cause or the causes of the crisis and how this differs from the so-called stagflation, the stagnation plus inflation of the 1970s. Both have been precipitated by war, the oil embargo introduced by the Arab oil-producing states in reaction against the United States' support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, and today the invasion of Ukraine with the consequent European sanctions against Russia. My question to begin is, what are the fundamental causes of inflation today, and how are these distinct from half a century ago? Philippa, you look like you want to start answering that question. Please feel free.
To ask the youngest in the round a historical question. I mean, I think when we start, we have to be clear that we're talking about inflation in Europe, right? Because I think inflation in the US and Europe are quite different. I mean, I think actually it's pretty similar in the sense that we have a cost shock, and we have to be very clear in Europe that inflation is driven by an external cost shock by energy. It's more gas than oil, but it is that. I know that there were calculations trying to show that it's demand, excessive demand, or that we get a wage price spiral, but we see none of that. So the fundamental reason being an external cost shock, Putin attacking the Ukraine, also Chinese dialing up gas usage in 2021. That really, I think, is the big driver. And there it's similar to an oil price shock. Now, what is a very different situation today from in the past, and I think there are people on the panel qualified a lot better than I am to speak on this, is what the response of labor is. That was organized to a very different extent. We had a very different position of industry. So, I mean, I can mainly speak from the German experience. But we haven't seen the ability of labor to get compensation for price increases. So we have massive real wage losses in Germany and the same in many other European countries. And that really, I think, is the big difference in dynamics. So in a way, I mean, that probably leads to inflation tallying off sooner, but it also means massive losses on the employee side in terms of wages, being able to afford a living, and that's pretty worrisome.
And Lena, you're obviously very conscious from a trade union perspective of the struggle on the part of wage earners to keep up with rising prices. So you might want to come in on that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And indeed, it is very, very clear that the current inflation is not due to supply side of the economy. In this sense, I think we completely agree that there are certain bottlenecks, but we also have to bear in mind that the inflation actually started going up before the war started in Ukraine. And partially, I think we need to look at or look for reasons in the COVID crisis that and all the lockdowns, very severe lockdowns that we came through, and where a lot of companies are trying to recuperate the losses that they acquired during the COVID lockdowns, because looking at data, it is also clear that if the price markup, for example, for goods or services has been increasing very slowly, then after the COVID situation is very different. So that's one of the elements to try to recuperate, I think, the profits. And now when it comes to wage bargaining, then actually the trade union side, we have been clearly trying to do our best, but we have been constantly arguing with the European Central Bank, with the European Commission, that immediately say that, now you have to moderate. You can't really ask for a sort of full recuperation of the real wage loss. Otherwise, we immediately have the wage price spiral and all the rest of it. And we have consistently argued that because the root causes of the inflation are elsewhere that they are not really on sort of wage-driven or supply-driven, then we cannot use the traditional remedies to try to fix the problem. But we have to really look at different ways of addressing it, because if you look at the nominal wage increases, they are there. They really are there. I mean, we read in the news where there has been negotiated wage increase more than 10%, but this still lags behind the need for the real wage growth. So they're kind of the issues, the problems are partially there as well. It is also very clear that the kind of central bank's insistence on increasing inflation rates is not actually helping. It is not helping to really curtail the inflation, and precisely because it doesn't come from the traditional source that would cool off the inflation by increasing the interest rates. Quite the contrary, and actually kind of strangely enough, the central banks themselves admit that the increases will cause pain. And if we look at the question sort of who then suffers the pain, who really sort of hurts, of course they are the ones who are the lowest paid, they are the families, the most vulnerable. They are not the sort of Wall Street or sort of investment big multinational corporations. They are not paying the price. They are the price setters, so they can recuperate from setting the higher price. And we can actually see that lots of the SMEs are struggling to survive. But on the other hand, we have big corporations that are making enormous profits. So, of course, I think what we also have to bear in mind is that if we use wrong policies to try to address the current cost of living crisis, or we wait for too long, it's not only that the families will be struggling, but it will have a knock-on effect on the whole economy. Because very clearly, and especially after the COVID lockdowns, we are now have to look at more internal consumption as a driver for growth. And if people don't have money, then the internal growth is not there either, or the internal demand is not there either. So it's not that we can kind of just push the pain to a certain group of people, but we really have to look at the bigger picture and how these different elements play in the broader growth and the possibility of people to manage their lives decently.
That's very interesting, Lena. One of the implications of what you're saying is that big companies now have even more market power than perhaps they had in the 1970s, and therefore they have the capacity to set prices in such a way as to sustain their profitability amid the inflation crisis in a way that perhaps wasn't the case during the 1970s. I want to bring you in on that last point, Georgia, about the differential impact of inflation and the cost of living crisis, particularly on the most vulnerable, because I know you've focused on how this doesn't actually work out in the same way for everyone at the different points on the household income spectrum. So do you want to just explain a little bit about the differential impacts of the crisis in that regard?
Yes, Robin, first of all, let me thank you for organizing the discussion and for inviting me. So I think I mean, in contrast with the 70s, we're now in a better position to measure things. We have much better data sets, computational tools. So before explaining my own research, let me draw your attention to a very interesting paper. I mean, people think of this monetary policy as causing pain to people through the demand channel. But there are also studies. There's an excellent study published last year, for example, in the European Economic Review, called the interest rate exposure of euro area households. Now, that is based on microdata from the Household Finance and Consumption Survey. That's a large household survey covering all euro area countries, and it provides the detailed information on households' assets and liabilities. So this study finds a large heterogeneity in how exposed different households are to interest rate hikes. And the results of this study are very interesting. They're showing that the current interest rate hikes are most probably hurting more households at the lower end of the net wealth distribution and younger households. So this is a direct impact of interest rate hikes on household finances. Now, going to the cost of living crisis, I've seen many studies, many numbers. The most recent one, I think, is by the European Central Bank. And they seem to be worried because as they measure the effective inflation rate for the lowest quintile of the European population is 2.2 percentage points higher than the effective inflation rates on the top quintile of the population. Now, that's an European Union average, which hides a lot of things. So if I contrast that to my own research, which is what I'm doing is how much the cost of living has increased for different households in Greece using household budget survey data. That shows that if households wanted to keep levels of consumption constant, if you're on the bottom decile of the distribution, that would mean around 16% increase in your cost of living. And that compares to just 6% if you belong to the top decile of the distribution, which is a much higher difference than 2.2 percentage points, like 10 percentage points. Okay, we're not measuring exactly the same thing, but you can understand the order of magnitude. And the second point is that the part which seems to be the most important, which is becoming more important, is the food, the element of food. So it's not so much about energy in Greece, at least. So after autumn, the poorest people are burdened most by the increase in the cost of food. So food prices keep increasing. Somehow energy prices have kind of stabilized or even have fallen, but food prices are increasing more and more.
Indeed. Thanks for that evidence, Georgia, from Greece, which obviously is an extreme case, but is reflected to a lesser degree across the continent. Let me move on then to how in the short term we can imagine the crisis being dealt with. We've already mentioned the, if you like, the one club approach of the European Central Bank of raising interest rates. But what are the various clubs, the various policy levers which should be pulled in order to minimize and mitigate the impacts of the crisis? I know, for instance, Lena, that the ETUC has a 6-point plan which it has articulated, and you may want to begin this point in the discussion, as part of the discussion, by referring to some of those points.
Thank you very much. Indeed, in the ETUC, we have put together a 6-point plan where we have a sort of action plan how to combat the cost of living crisis. And to shortly tell what these 6 points are, then first is very clearly the pay rise needs to meet the increase, and pay rise in terms of through collective bargaining. But here also we have to, I mean, it's the age-old fight for trade unions is for fair pay that can also help to sustain the economy. Then secondly, we definitely need assistance and help. So targeted assistance, targeted payments for household, for people who are struggling to afford their energy bills, to buy food and to pay their rent. Because very, very clearly we are now in the winter period, and it is even more difficult for people to pay all the bills. And it is not unusual now that a family has to choose between eating or heating. So it's kind of, they have to turn down the temperature in their house. And not to the kind of level that you just put on an extra layer and you feel comfortable, but really sort of to the extent that it's not comfortable anymore. But in order to be able to put food on the table, they have to make this this choice because the bills have become unaffordable. And from our point of view, also there needs to be a ban on disconnections. You cannot possibly disconnect people from essential services like water or electricity because they haven't paid their bills. Then the debate that has been ongoing at European level, also political level, is the price caps, and especially when it comes to energy bills, also the kind of not just tax on excessive profits, but the watertight tax, because we also see that some of the member states that have experimented already with the tax on excessive profits, they haven't really got the yield that they were expecting, because and especially the big multinationals are so good at hiding their profits or distributing it all throughout their network. Then national and European anti-crisis support measures to really protect incomes and jobs, especially in industries, because we also read now more and more often, and even today, the leaders, European leaders, are supposed to discuss the industrial plan for Europe for next year, because we see that because of the different approach and the different inflation and the different support packages compared to the US, for example, the investments are leaving Europe, they go towards the US. So we very clearly need the support to keep the industry in Europe, because we can't turn Europe into a sort of industrial wasteland. We need production in Europe. But at the same time, we also need to have a sort of shore type measures to protect jobs. Because we saw that during the COVID pandemic crisis, the shore instrument that was very quickly put in place to support short-time work schemes and to try to keep people in employment, but to compensate their wages that the companies couldn't pay, it worked really well. And the feedback from everywhere in Europe has been positive. So we need to really have, I would say, reformed measure, but something that helps to protect jobs, incomes, and that also helps to finance social measures to cope with the crisis, and at the same time cope with the transitions that we have, the green and digital. The fifth point is that we need to reform the functioning of the EU energy market. We really have to look how this functions and what can be done there, and also to recognize that energy is a public good, and investment to tackle the root causes really needs to be done. And of course, the sixth one is that the trade unions need to have a seat at the table to design and implement all these anti-crisis measures. Because if we are not around the table, then inevitably the measures, if and when they are put in place, they are going to be poorer at quality, less targeted, and will not have such a, I would say, intended positive effect necessarily.
Thanks, Nina. Philippa, whenever you were initiating the discussion, you were stressing this wasn't inflation arising from an excess of demand, and Lena was talking about the need, in fact, to raise internal demand in domestic economies in Europe, in a context where there is a risk that interest rate rises by the ECB will instigate a recession instead. How do you think internal demand should be enhanced in Europe to stave off the possibility of recession?
Yeah, thank you. Lena, I thought that point was really interesting because that's really going to be one of the main challenges going forward. Robin, as you said, I think the ECB is gonna just add to the pain. Georgia seems Greece is ahead of the cycle, but here the shock is definitely only kind of fully developing. I mean, we have some political measures against it, but I think spring is going to be difficult. With the US slowing down, China slowing down, it's not quite clear where our demand is coming from. Plus, then the interest rate hikes hit fully. So then, yeah, the question is like, what do you actually do to keep your economy going? And I fully agree with Lena that we will need more internal demand, and that for us here for sure is a massive challenge because it really goes to the structure of our economy, right? I mean, the German economy has been very export driven. That's how we've been making money in the past. That was our business model, exporting a lot of high value goods to the US, importing the parts from China. And now if we want to switch that, and if some energy intensive industries are not as competitive as in the past, then what do we do? What we need for internal demand to go up is we need more people who have enough money in their bank accounts to spend it. In Germany, we have 30% of people without any money or substantial savings in their bank accounts. So, I mean, there you have a real constraint on demand. So pretty large, low wage sector, even though you have high employment, a lot of people with not that much money to spend. And then if you try and match that with, what jobs are they working and where's that coming from? I mean, Germany, as every other country, is now an economy where most people work in the service sector. And actually our public services are pretty big. So public social services are huge. And these are actually some of the sectors that have really bad pay. So it's education, it's, carers, it's people working in hospital looking after the elderly. 1/3 of the German wage bill is going into public services and a lot of those social services. And these are all the people earning very poor money. So what I think we personally need to do is we need to somehow manage to pay these people better. First of all, because we need them and we don't have enough. And secondly, because we need to get a better balance in our economy and we need to have more internal demand, and that only comes when people who are paid poorly get more money. And this is where it gets really, really difficult and where you really have to think about the structure of your public finances, because obviously, I mean, that money is coming out of the public purse and public purses are now really heavily strained. That's why I also worry that it's not going to happen. I mean, this is going straight to Christian Lindner's bottom line. So how can we make that work and how can we generate the funds to actually have higher current expenditure for all these public social services? And that's probably where we get to the revenue side, and we actually need to look at how do we generate more of that? How do we have less accumulation of, very large wealth that doesn't enter the real economy anymore? How do we manage to tax that out to get it back into circulation and get it back into wages to have more money circulating in the internal economy? So it's really becoming a debate, I think, about revenue generation.
Robin, am I allowed to add a point to what Philippa is saying? I think that's a general problem in how we evaluate how healthy the public sector is. So what we're looking at all these decades is public debt. And I think what we should be looking at is the net wealth of the public sector. So, for example, if we invest in public health care, that really, increases public deficit. So that's a problem, but that's a public investment that is going to bear fruits in the future. In Greece, we had the opposite problem, like during the crisis, we had to bring down debt. So privatization was a means to bring down debt. But what if you sell out public assets at a very low price? Apparently the public sector is worse off. So I think we have a wrong addiction to looking at public debt. We should be looking at the net wealth of the public sector, which of course is something much harder to measure.
Well, I want to come on, Georgia, to public investment and the longer term in a moment. But just while you have the floor, and I'll come to you in a second, Philippa, while you have the floor, Georgia, I was going to ask you, as an economist, your thoughts on the minimum wage directive and national minimum income schemes in easing the pain for the most vulnerable in the current crisis. And obviously the recent minimum wage directive, which has emerged from the European Union, is one which would set a minimum wage of 60% of the median, and would also encourage collective bargaining. So that could be an important way, and I invite your comments, to address particularly the needs of the most vulnerable in the crisis.
Yes, I fully agree. I think that's really, Europe should be congratulated on this. It's really very important. So I would fully agree. The thing is, if you do some simulations, as I was saying before, for the Greek cost of living crisis, you would need for the poorest households. If you simulate a household with 2 people earning minimum wage, and you calculate the increase in the cost of living, you would need an increase of the order of 70% of the minimum wage in Greece. And now we are talking about increases of 3 or 7 or even 10%. So this is really the minimum one can do. And as far as support measures for the vulnerable are concerned, I think we need also to look at implementation issues. So the economically reasonable thing to say is don't waste money on the rich. So you should target help assistance to the vulnerable. The thing is, how do you do that? So let me again give you a Greek example. Greece was, I think, one of the last countries that introduced this minimum income scheme. That was the national rollout of this scheme was in 2017. In view of the economic crisis, the massive economic crisis. Now, one thing that had puzzled me then was that the money that was budgeted for this scheme was not spent in the end. Only some portion of it was spent in the end. And I was wondering why. And then 2 years later, a World Bank study appeared. And according to this, I mean, it was trying to evaluate the national rollout of this scheme. And it turns out that 60% of the bottom decile hadn't got this minimum income. Because of, I mean, everybody knows the problems of means-tested benefits. And assistance targeted to the poor is, again, a kind of means-tested benefit. So I think we should be doing more.
Philippa, I'm sorry, I stopped you a moment ago there. You wanted to come back into the discussion.
I wanted to ask Georgia something, because this question of only looking at debt is becoming even more topical right now in Europe, because we have a new proposal for the fiscal rules by the European Commission that very heavily focuses on the debt stock. I mean, basically says the objective of the fiscal rules is debt stock only, which to me is striking. But the question is, what do you do with it, and how do you create a fuller picture? And one approach is to say, well, let's complete the balance sheet. So if we look at the liabilities, we look at the debt stock, then, and Georgia hinted at that, we need to look at the assets. And then, you know, it becomes harder and harder when you say, well, let's not only take like physical assets, like concrete, but actually human capital. But that is important to count, because, you know, as advanced economies, what really drives future wealth is human capital. Now, the World Bank has actually done quite a bit in terms of human capital accounting, and tried to create full balance sheets that account for that. So literally, you know, looking at how well educated people are, and then how much income can they generate, and then you discount it and put it on a balance sheet. And I'm always a bit torn on whether this is a good approach, because on the one hand, it does create a fuller picture. So, you know, you get a more balanced discussion, and you can kind of respond something to what the current stance is. On the other hand, I mean, when you look more closely, it's so hard to do. I mean, it's really kind of black magic you have to do in order to create that balance sheet, and it's pretty arbitrary. So I wanted to ask Georgia what she thinks about this, and whether, you know, if they start with debt, one should run into the balance sheet direction and complete the balance sheet, or whether one really needs to take the discussion away from that and make clear that the state is something different, and that we're talking about things that we, if we're really honest, can't count that way. Which direction would you take it?
Yes, I do understand what you say, because for 10 years I've been participating in the government finance working group of the ECB as a participant, the Bank of Greece. And I do understand, when we're talking about statistics, how difficult it is to make it comparable, even public debt or public deficit. I mean, these are ongoing discussions, let alone introducing the asset side of the public sector. I mean, I already said it's very difficult to measure. And then, I don't know, I think that fiscal rules should really have to take into account some at least qualitative indicators. But then again, you also have this problem that once you allow for more flexibility, for example, through looking at the qualitative indicators, you have technocrats complaining that you allow some leeway for member states to start using these qualitative indicators to get away from fiscal discipline. I really don't know. I think it's a very difficult problem. But at least I think there should be some discussion about it, at least, and not just focusing on one variable.
Maybe just briefly, and then Robin. I'll shut up. No, because we thought very hard about this problem of, you know, how do you incorporate into fiscal policy what productive expenditures are? And I mean, the answer in the past has been we need to do an investment rule, and I'm skeptical of that, because if you actually, you know, we tried to play it through for Germany, and what you really end up with is roads, because, you know, that's a big physical goods investment, and actually what we need is investment into education, but that means teacher salaries. So how do you really account for productive expenditures? And what we did is we took that very much unliked potential output calculation. I mean, it's there and it's in our constitution, and we said, how about instead of saying potential output is just what your economic performance was in the past, how about you make that dependent on fiscal policy? And yes, you have to discuss that in Parliament. So, you know, there has to be an argument of, well, we're putting X much money into early childhood education, so that will get us that productive potential. But honestly, fiscal policy is political. So you need to have that discussion. And I think we have strong enough democracy that we can actually reason about this. If someone shows up in Parliament and says, well, lowering the pension age by 10 years will increase productivity, everybody will know that, you know, this may or may not be the right thing normatively, but it won't. But putting money into early childhood education will. I think we have good enough a debate to be able to discuss this. And in that way, we thought you could incorporate it and you know, literally make your fiscal space dependent on where you're putting money in a slightly more intelligent way than just this black and white investment calculation that doesn't really match with what actually benefits our economies.
That's true, and I think that would take us back to Robin's point about EU-wide minimum wage directive. I think another idea would be to introduce an EU-wide child benefit, for example. That would be a good idea to put forward.
Which could be linked to the child guarantee. The discussion is moving towards...
Robin, could I just come in for a moment?
Yeah, of course.
I think one thing that I find really wrong in the way we measure everything in the economy is precisely the question is, why is educating, so preparing people for the labor market to be productive, or keeping us all healthy and safe, why is it a cost? Why is it an expenditure? And why isn't an investment? If we shift the thinking there, that we really sort of take educating people, educating our children from preschool all throughout university, vocational training, if we take it as an investment, we see things very differently. Also, when it comes to the fiscal rules, I mean, obviously the proposal is to give more flexibility to member states to kind of balance again their budgets and to reduce their debt and deficit. But what we've been also arguing is that, and there are discussions ongoing in the council working groups, is to in order to balance the fiscal rules even a little bit, we should also have not only the macroeconomic imbalances procedure, but we should have also social imbalances procedure. And these need to be linked in the sense that I'm not talking about sort of punishments or penalties or sanctions, but I'm talking about that if there are social imbalances, then the macroeconomic imbalances need to address how to alleviate these social imbalances and not just look at purely the budget sort of the traditional way of looking at the debt and the deficit. But I think for me, the core question is, why isn't health and education investment? Because these guarantee that people can actually be productive and can create this traditional investment as we understand it.
Well, I wanted to move on to talk about public investment because if as has been said, the cost of living crisis is not a crisis on the demand side, but reflects more deficiencies on the supply side. For example, obviously the deficiencies in sources of energy in the current context and the need therefore to have more domestic sources of renewable energy. That does mean big public investments will be needed to remedy these supply deficiencies, and our discussion about the fiscal rules is already touching on that. And I wanted to ask in that context whether you think that some kind of successor to the Recovery and Resilience Facility that was established because of the COVID-19 pandemic could be central to the kind of large-scale public investment that is implied to deal with particularly the green transition and reducing energy costs, but in a way that, as you've hinted, Lena, is also socially responsible at the same time, because you would be talking about very big numbers in terms of what would be involved. Philip, would you like to come in on that? You've
Sure.
certainly emphasized this point about the supply side.
Sure. Definitely have an opinion on that one. I mean, I think it depends on what you want the European fiscal construct to be. Do you want sovereign debt at the national level, or do you essentially want it to be foreign currency debt and you want to limit balance sheets? At the moment, the direction seems to be we want to limit that. That's what the Commission is proposing, bringing national debt levels down. Now, we try to do some back of the envelope calculations of whether it's possible to bring debt levels down and at the same time invest in climate. So, I mean, we assume incremental investment of 1% of GDP plus defense, everybody going up to 2%. I think that actually leaves out a lot of necessary things. So that's more of a lower bound. What we found is that even without those incremental investments, just taking the rising costs of financing, because interest rates are going up, because of cost of aging, debt levels will already increase. With putting that on top, debt levels will be higher than before. So without anything at the European level, it's simply impossible, unless someone invents a magic wand, to reconcile the goals of limiting the balance sheet and doing what's required. So if the goal is to limit balance sheets, to bring down debt stocks, then yes, we definitely need to have something at the European level. And you know, that might be more stable in a currency union. So then that's the way forward. Otherwise, you need to rethink the national level.
Thinking about the European accounts, Lena, you mentioned earlier excess profits that were accumulated in the current crisis, and obviously on the revenue side of the equation, if high wealth and high profits, the rents that have been accumulated in that context could be taxed more effectively, then that would help on the revenue side to fund public investment. But that's obviously more difficult than it was in the 1970s because of globalization and the way that so much of these really major assets are not accessible in any individual nation state anymore. What is the ETUC's view on how to capture through taxation globally mobile wealth and high incomes?
And very clearly, we have been very supportive throughout the OECD-led process for corporate taxation. And when just at the beginning of this week, end of last week, we read that Hungary has dropped their veto on then this morning we are reading that now Poland is vetoing the European directive. So
this is for a 15% minimum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's for the 15. And I mean, for us, again, through many congresses now, the demand has been 25%, not 15%. But okay, if we can have 15% to start with, but then the question is also, is it an effective tax or is it a nominal one? Because it makes a difference. Very clearly, from our point of view, we really need to end the tax competition to the bottom in the European Union. We cannot have it. Another thing is that the European Union really needs to take seriously the tax evasion and tax avoidance, both. Okay, one is a crime, the other one is just a kind of business tactics, but we really have to tackle this very seriously, because there is so much money actually also in Europe that is hidden away or sent around the world through really aggressive tax planning, that we need to also look how this is all done. I mean, we had, if we had more time, I could show a slide of just one corporation and all the operations where and how they kind of shift their profits and hide them away so that they don't have to pay tax. So tax is increasingly more prominent in the trade union, in the ETUC discourse, and we are preparing now for the new Congress, which will take place actually in Berlin in May next year. And the taxes is one of the very important debates that our members want to have. But what makes it difficult for us in the ETUC to have this tax debate is also that it's a national competence, especially when we are talking about the wealth tax or individual tax. It is the national competence. And we have also very different views among our membership in terms of sort of whether there should be, whether we should say anything at European level on taxation, or whether we just should keep our hands off and just say that it's a national competence and only member states can deal with it. Our view is that we need more progressive tax. We need to really look at the wealth taxation, especially the sort of top 10%, because they have made actually enormous gains through the COVID crisis. It's just the figures are frightening. And when it comes to the sort of European level instrument, similar to the Recovery and Resilience Fund, then we are actively advocating this to happen, to make this funding permanent. We all know that what is also sometimes in political speak called the frugals, agreed to the RRF instrument only if it's temporary. But it is very clear that, like Philippa said, in order actually for member states to invest in green and digital, it is not possible without a sort of common financial instrument that would facilitate, that would allow it. And especially when we are talking about these kind of green investments, whether it's in infrastructure, energy production, lots of it is cross-border. Europe is open. And so we need to definitely have Europe-wide big projects that help us to improve the physical and also digital connectedness in Europe. So for us, there is no question, 110% we need a permanent European level instrument, and especially when we have the common currency. And if the interest rates in different member states are very, very different in order for them to meet the investment needs, it's just going to impact on all of us.
Georgia, you're be aware of the debates in the economics profession about this, and as Lena said, there has been over the last decade this tension between the so-called frugal 5, then 4, when Germany no longer became so frugal, states versus the Southern European ones, over issues such as austerity and the pandemic-linked recovery. Do you detect any shift in the profession in terms of more of a reversion to a Keynesian kind of focus on investment and an acceptance of the benefits of borrowing to invest, or do you think there's still strong resistance to that, which might manifest itself over the coming years in calls for a return to austerity? What's your sense of the mood amongst economists in this regard?
I think the COVID crisis kind of proved how necessary governments are. So I don't think, I mean, this obsession with austerity is so large and, now. But in terms of investment funds, I mean, I want to add a point that what Lina's very correctly said is that we should be taking into account the distributional aspects of these of the RRF, for example. Just to give a Greek example, according to the RRP of the Greek government, of the plan how to use the money.
This recovery plan, yeah.
The recovery plan, yeah. So the money directed to SMEs, because I think there is also a consensus now in Europe that SMEs should be supported. The criteria for financing, for giving loans from the RRF to SMEs rule out something like 85% of Greek SMEs due to size factors. So this is kind of strange. So, for example, out of 850,000 businesses in Greece, only 50,000 are considered eligible for loans. Now, I think that the transformation that Europe is aspiring, I mean, has to respect the structure of national economies. And I'm not saying this is, I mean, in Greece, we have the habit of blaming Europe for everything, but there is a lot of homework to do. And I think this is true for everybody. So I think attention should be paid on how money is spent, because as you say, with austerity, when the economy is in crisis, and Greece has been in crisis for, I don't know, the last 13 years, then the argument is that even if people suffer, the government cannot help because there is not enough fiscal space. So this makes even more important what we do when we have money to spend, right? Like the RRF. So, and I think that's why, I mean, people's incomes should be supported when you do have the money. And that's why distributional concerns are of top priority in these plans.
I want finally, Philippa, to turn to you. Your think tank is, in its name, future-oriented. And I wanted to finish with you in terms of how you think, very broadly, you can sketch for our viewers and listeners how we get from this awful crisis that we are in to the kind of society we want to be in, which is focused more on well-being, which is ecologically sustainable, and isn't so focused on producing endless material stuff. I know that could be an hour discussion, but just in a few minutes, just to finish the discussion, I'd like you to touch on that theme.
I was going to say, I think that could fill a book. I'll start with something very prosaic, because I think you need to start with like politicians and you know what their headline numbers are, because it's going to be very difficult to do something that doesn't really pay in. And at the moment, you know, we're focused on GDP. And GDP maybe at some point was an accurate reflection or a good proxy for what, you know, created wealth. I mean, it was created in the US to show the progress of industrialization and how that added wealth to the economy. It was there as a promotional indicator. We're not at that stage anymore. I fully agree with Lena that, you know, saying, oh, we're just going to deindustrialize and it's all fine. I mean, that's not the right direction. But showing how much physical value add we have does not proxy very well whether we have an increase in wealth. So I think we need to adjust that. It's actually very non-trivial how to do that well. I'm not that convinced by having 50 gazillion very complex indicators. But we could start with two things. We could start with taking account for emissions in GDP, so subtracting that because it is a cost. And then secondly, making explicit the value of actually having a healthy and well-educated population. So adjust the goal that politicians are working towards and what they can present at the end of the year. And then I think we really need to work towards a much more balanced economy. So one that has less wealth accumulation, which always requires more debt to keep it going, because you have a lot of money that doesn't enter the real economy, sits in bank accounts, goes into financial markets. So we need to rebalance, which means we need to become better at extracting money that, you know, accumulates, or rejig power balances, so you know you have stronger bargaining power and more money goes into wages instead of dividends, essentially. And then I think we need to start to be able to pay jobs according to what they benefit society, and that's really what we got completely wrong. And this is where you have, you know, the real intersection between fiscal policy and the labor market, and where it becomes really interesting. So I think if we want to make progress, that's where we need to work and what we need to understand better. So actually, you know, literally do things like running simulations of what happens if you increase wages in social services that are essential for future wealth, and what that does to the economy, what the fiscal multipliers are. All very difficult, but we will need to do that if we want to rejig our economies from export profit driven to wage driven, and a more healthy balance of demand.
Well, it's been a very interesting hour's discussion, and I'm very grateful to you all for contributing to it. I said at the beginning that it was an unusual discussion of the cost of living crisis and being conducted entirely by women. And I think it's proved a much more wide-ranging and complex and interesting discussion as a result of that. So thank you all very much for taking part, and thank you to everyone for watching and listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
Okay, everyone, the recording's over, and